Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch with me, your host Vikas Swarup. The Russia-Ukraine war has been raging since February 24 this year with no end in sight. It is now Europe's biggest ground war since the Second World War. It has caused massive death and destruction, looks set to become the largest refugee crisis in Europe this century, and has caused prices of food and fuel to soar, pushing the world towards food scarcity and a global inflation. On September 21, Russian President Vladimir Putin raised the stakes in the Ukrainian conflict to a dangerous new level as he announced a partial mobilization and threatened to use nuclear weapons. In a speech aired on national TV, he said, "This is not a bluff, and those who try to blackmail us with nuclear weapons should know that the weather vane can turn and point towards them." On September 30, President Putin also announced annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. International reaction was swift. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned the rattling of nuclear sabers and called for the end of nuclear blackmail. US President Joe Biden described it as an extremely significant violation of the UN Charter and accused President Putin of making irresponsible nuclear threats, adding that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The European Commission said that President Putin is engaging in a very dangerous nuclear gamble and asked him to stop such reckless behavior. While India did not respond specifically to the nuclear threat, its position has been quite clear. India has repeatedly emphasized the immediate cessation of hostilities and the need to resolve the ongoing conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. This was reiterated by Prime Minister Narendra Modi during his meeting with President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the SCO summit in Samarkand on September 16, when he told him that today's era is not the era of war. India has also underlined the need to respect the UN Charter and sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. So what does the raising of the nuclear stakes mean for the war in Ukraine and for the world at large? Is it time to rethink the doctrine of nuclear deterrence that has kept great power war at bay for 3/4 of a century? To discuss these issues, I have with me 2 of the best experts possible. Ambassador Rakesh Sood is one of India's foremost authorities on international security issues. He set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division in the Ministry of External Affairs and was India's first permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament at the United Nations in Geneva, besides serving as India's ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. Dr. Manpreet Sethi is a distinguished fellow and head of the Nuclear Security Project at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. She is an expert on a range of nuclear issues, having published over 9 books and over 100 papers in academic journals of repute over the last 25 years. A very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Ambassador Sood. What do you make of President Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons? Now, he has said it is not a bluff, but is it?
Well, to be fair, President Putin has been rattling the nuclear saber even before 24th of February. If you remember, there were these nuclear exercises and it came out in the media that he attended those exercises. This was in the early part of February. Thereafter, on 24th of February, in his famous speech where he announced the special military operation, at that time also he said, in case we are opposed, the world will see consequences that it has never witnessed before. That was also a veiled nuclear threat. And thereafter, on a couple of days later, he announced what was called a special combat readiness. So there is that nuclear saber rattling that has been going on, and I think what we saw most recently was perhaps a more explicit example. Now, what does this mean? What are the likely options before President Putin? First option would have been an early use of nuclear weapons to gain advantage. Now that is over because the war has already dragged on for 7 months. Second is, for Putin, it could be a weapon of last resort. Is he so far down that it is the last resort? We don't know, we'll see. A third option could be a miscalculation. You know, something happens, there is intelligence comes in which is erroneous, and in the decision-making time frame, it gets into that mode. And the fourth could be a complete loss of command and control. So far, we haven't seen that. He seems to be pretty much in command. And according to even Western intelligence sources, they indicate that they have not seen any movement of nuclear weapons or nuclear-related weaponry in any form. So I think that so far it remains bluff. Unless we look at the second option, that does he think he is on his last leg, so it becomes a weapon of last resort? For that, we need to look a little deeper into the conduct of the war, his objectives, Western objectives, and the prospects of peace which Prime Minister Modi has talked about.
Dr. Sethi, what is your take? And what is Russia's nuclear policy in terms of why, when, and how it would use nuclear weapons?
So I think what President Putin is doing is playing nuclear deterrence by the playbook. He is making all the nuclear noises periodically from the time that he's gone into the conflict. And he's trying to signal to the other side that there's a limit to how much the US and NATO should come to the help of Ukraine. I think this is also understood by the West because they have been constrained by the kinds of weapon systems that they have provided to Ukraine in this conflict. But I think also what President Putin understands is that the threat of use of nuclear weapons is perhaps going to be more powerful than the actual use of nuclear weapons, because finding the right target when you want to use nuclear weapons is going to be a very difficult proposition. Should it be in Ukraine, which will then mean annexing a wasteland which Russia wants to annex finally? Or if it was in any other NATO country, then he's bringing back the nuclear wrath of NATO also on himself. So therefore, the use of the weapon is going to be extremely difficult, and I think this is well understood. The nuclear doctrine of Russia, as we understand it, from what they have announced, also recently.
There was a revision in 2020.
That's right, in which they said that if the existence of Russia is threatened, so if anything poses an existential risk to Russia, then they go in for a use of nuclear weapon. Now, one can question what is an existential risk. Is the regime survival also an existential risk? Are the new, those 4 regions that you've mentioned that they have taken in now, any threat to them from Ukraine to take it back? Is that going to pose an existential risk? Or is it only when Moscow or some other important cities of Russia are threatened? Now, going by logic, that seems to be the only existential risk really to Russia. And I don't see that happening in the near term. So therefore, as I said, I mean, it's the threat of use which is bringing him far more benefits than the actual use of the weapon.
So, Ambassador Sood, what nuclear weapons are we talking about here in the Ukrainian scenario? Experts say that it is likely that tactical nuclear weapons are likely to be used instead of strategic ones. Could you explain to our viewers what is the difference between tactical and strategic?
Because this is actually a distinction that has been brought in the context of US and former Soviet Union. Because there are 2 countries that have been separated by thousands of kilometers. They don't share a border.
Correct.
And so it is estimated that an intercontinental ballistic missile would take about 25 minutes if launched from Russia to hit the furthest point of American heartland. So the definition of a strategic weapon in this terminology is a weapon which has a range of more than 6,500 kilometers. So an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, is something like that. And this also includes long-range bombers, incidentally, because the bombers have that kind of range. Now, Today, Russian arsenal is estimated at approximately 6,000 warheads or bombs, out of which about 1,500 are awaiting dismantlement. That leaves about 4,500. Out of that, there are about 1,600 which are considered to be strategic, namely this long range. And those are covered by the New START treaty between US and Russia, which is due to expire in 2026, but so far is holding. The balance, about 3,000, are intermediate range, that is below 6,500. So these could be anything from 4,000, 3,000 less, and including some gravity bombs, nuclear artillery shells, and that kind of a thing, short range weapons. So these are what are normally called tactical. However, what is important is that in case, as Manpreet said, it depends on where these are supposed to be used, because you don't need to use a weapon with a range of 3,000 kilometers or 4,000 kilometers for Ukraine. I mean, it's just next door.
Yes, exactly.
So you could use a small device. Normally, tactical weapons have very limited yields of, say, anything from 10 kilotons or 10,000 tons equivalent of TNT to, let's say, about 100 kilotons.
For comparison purposes, what was the yield for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombs that were dropped?
Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in the range of 15 kilotons. So even 100 kilotons would be equivalent of more than 6 Hiroshimas.
My God.
So that's, we call it tactical, but it's, so that is why in India, we have never made a distinction between tactical and strategic for two reasons. One is because they are enormously destructive, and the second is that in our context, where we have two nuclear armed adversaries, one to the north and one to our west, the distances are 5 minutes flying time for a weapon. So it really makes no difference whether you label it tactical or strategic.
Dr. Sethi, now the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and I think was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. So was it nuclear deterrence that helped resolve it and bring the temperature down?
Yes, interestingly, we are in the month of October, and this year, it is 60 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think many organizations around the world that look at nuclear issues were actually planning to do little seminars and conferences to recall that experience and to get people once again to understand, because human memory is short and you tend to forget, what had happened then. So the idea was to recall those risks and get people to understand them once again. We never knew Russia, Ukraine would give us a reality show about what these risks exactly are. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, nuclear deterrence, as you mentioned, did play a very important role. I think both countries understood what the dangers were, that they were at that precipice where they could slip into a large-scale nuclear exchange very quickly.
What was known as mutually assured destruction.
Assured destruction. So both, presidents on both the sides were acutely aware of what this was. And I think one good example of understanding how acutely aware they were was, since we know so much more from the Western literature about how President Kennedy handled the situation than about what President Khrushchev was doing at that moment. But from President Kennedy, we know when the options were presented to him about how he should tackle the situation, he opted for something which was the least destabilizing option, which was the naval blockade. It was a military action to show resolve and yet buy time for any kind of a political resolution to the problem. So the dangers of nuclear deterrence, the weapons that both of them held, 70,000 nuclear weapons, plus the tactical nuclear weapons that Ambassador Sood just spoke about. But I would say, besides nuclear deterrence, there were three other factors that were important. One was luck, dollops of luck, I think, because even when things went wrong, somehow it did not lead to escalation. So we had the U-2 that was flying over Cuba, that was shot down by Russia, and yet the US held back. So there was, a lot of luck that was coming into play here. Secondly, the wisdom of the leadership, I think. At that moment in time, the sensitivity that both of them showed that they were caught in this, trap, and that they had to somehow jointly get out of this trap. So the kinds of letters that we know that were exchanged between the two presidents, trying to, unentangle the knot as much as they could. So I think there was some wisdom there. And thirdly, some kind of a control over the media, which is what is missing in today's times. You know, with social media, we all know how quickly escalation of things can happen, how much pressure can be built on the leadership to take actions that they might not otherwise take.
It was a fabulous history lesson. Now, Ambassador Sood, we heard what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but how has nuclear deterrence evolved over the years since the 1960s? Is it now very different from the nuclear deterrence that was being practiced during the Cold War?
Yes, it is. And, you know, during the Cold War, it was a bipolar era. The world was divided into two nuclear superpowers. Not to say that there weren't other countries with nuclear weapons. In UK, France, and China, these three countries also had nuclear weapons. But in terms of orders of magnitude, their arsenals were very, very small. Just to give you an example, out of a total of more than 70,000 nuclear weapons that existed in, let's say, early 1980s, more than 65,000 were accounted for by US and Soviet Union. And the other three all put together accounted for less than 1,500. So that should give you an idea of the magnitude. So therefore, the nuclear equation between US and Soviet Union was the one that drove deterrence theory and so on. Now, as was said, the deterrence theory was based on two things: mutually assured destruction and second strike capability. So what happened was that because of this enormous arsenals that they had built up, there was this assurance that even after receiving a first strike, they would have enough capability to be able to launch an equally devastating strike on the adversary. And this was the heart of nuclear deterrence. This was called deterrence both by denial and punishment, in the sense that you were denying the adversary his military objective and assuring the adversary of punishment, unacceptable punishment. So that was it. Now, the Cold War has ended. There are many more nuclear players on the scene, and therefore the way people are redefining nuclear deterrence is to see if deterrence can fill other roles. Like, for example, in our neighborhood, Pakistan talks of full spectrum deterrence.
Correct.
You know, what it means we can explore on another occasion. China has a different approach. We have declared a no first use policy.
Which means we will not be the first to use nuclear weapons.
Yes. So, and a minimum credible deterrent, because we don't want to get drawn into an arms race. Russia is looking at a new role, which is to use nuclear weapons with a view to achieving perhaps a degree of coercion or compellence.
Following on from what Ambassador Sood said, talking about our immediate neighborhood, closer home. Now, India has repeatedly been subjected to nuclear warning from Pakistan since the 1980s. Now, Kargil was one example, where after seizing territory, Pakistan signaled that it might use its nuclear weapons if India sought to retake that territory. So how did India respond in that particular case?
So Kargil happened very soon after India and Pakistan tested their nuclear weapons, and in a way it validated the theory that the rest of the West was telling us, that there are these two countries who will not know how to handle a crisis. And I think India's response to what happened at Kargil gives us a very good example of how to handle a crisis in the presence of nuclear weapons. Several lessons, I think, came out of this. For Pakistan, it was that nuclear weapons have not given it a carte blanche, that it can carry on with acts of terrorism against India, that India's options are closed, that it will not be able to respond. For India, the lesson was that you will have to use your force in a calibrated, contained fashion. So it cannot be the old-time, full-scale mobilization. And I think Op Parakram further reinforced this conclusion for us, that calibrated use of force has to be the answer to the kinds of pinpricks that will keep coming to us from Pakistan. And again, since Kargil, I think, with Uri, with Pathankot, India has shown that you can punish Pakistan for its behavior, but that force will have to be applied with a certain sense of ability to contain it, so that
for instance, we did not cross the LOC
at the time of Kargil,
yes.
Yeah, where we decided that our air attacks would remain to our side of the border. That was an indication to say we recognize that nuclear weapons are there, but that you can still punish Pakistan.
Now, as Dr. Sethi said, India's surgical strikes in Uri and the Balakot airstrike in response to Pakistani terror attacks showed that India was not deterred by Pakistani nuclear threats. So what is India's security calculus that has allowed us to undertake these missions despite the overhang of a nuclear threat?
Well, one, as I mentioned earlier, the nuclear deterrence theology. And as I mentioned earlier, the mutually assured destruction, assured second strike capability, underwritten by mutual vulnerability. That is what led to the whole Western or US-Soviet model of nuclear deterrence. Now, in our case, what we have is an asymmetrical situation between two neighboring countries. Time frames, as I said, are extremely small, just minutes. Secondly, we have much more limited arsenals as compared to what the US and Soviet Union had or even still possess. Third, we don't really have the early warning systems in place, because how much of early warning, even if we had those satellite-borne radars and early warning systems, we would probably get a 3-4 minute warning. So what could we redeploy? What could we deploy to counter that? Extremely difficult, even if you have active missile defenses and so on. So therefore, as Manpreet was saying, we have to rely, even though there is an asymmetry in terms of doctrines, like, as I said, we use a no first use
Pakistan
policy.
does not have
Pakistan does not have a no first use. It does not rule out a first use by defining its deterrence as full spectrum deterrence. And by doing that, it wants to give a certain role to its nuclear capability. But at the same time, there is a certain reliance on rationality. And we do feel that the Pakistani nuclear assets are under control of their army, under control of their military, and it is expected to act in a rational manner as long as the threshold of our kinetic retaliation to a terrorist attack like Pulwama or Uri or Pathankot is kept below a certain nuclear threshold. And so there is that element of calculated rationality that comes into play here.
Okay, following on from that, Dr. Sethi. Now, some experts say that the danger of nuclear war is today much greater than it was in the 1980s. We saw North Korea recently declare itself as a nuclear weapon state. The Iran nuclear deal looks almost dead. Attempts are still being made to revive it. So how do you assess the current global non-proliferation scenario?
So the global non-proliferation scenario, I would say, is very gloomy. We see that the norm of non-proliferation, which has stayed for such a long period of time, is under some kind of a threat at this moment. And I say that, the NPT review conference has just ended. This review conference marks 50 years of the existence of the NPT. It was supposed to take place in 2020. It was due to COVID that it had to be postponed 2 or 3 times. And the understanding was that it's a good thing that it had to be postponed, because President Trump, had it happened in 2020, would have been with the presidentship of President Trump in the White House then, and he wasn't particularly inclined towards multilateral institutions or about the idea of non-proliferation, etc. So the thought was that if it was postponed, it will be a good thing and it will take place in a better climate. Unfortunately, it had to take place in the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And even before the review conference took place, and we saw that it could not achieve a consensus document, even before that, the divisions between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, as defined by the NPT, have been there. We also find divisions between the nuclear weapon states, amongst the non-nuclear weapon states. So there are a whole lot of fissures which are evident today in the context of the non-proliferation regime. I would say what we are seeing today is vertical proliferation is happening. The big powers, all of the 9 nuclear weapon states actually, but particularly the big powers, are expanding their arsenal. They are improving their capabilities. They're bringing in new technologies which are going to interfere with nuclear deterrence, and there is no arms control in place to put a check on any of this. We find no strategic stability talks are happening at this moment. The threat of horizontal nuclear proliferation also remains.
So in the wake of the nuclear threat in Ukraine, how should the world respond?
Well, I think, as I said, right now we see an element at dampening down the tensions on the part of NATO by emphasizing that they're not seeing any movement. However, were there to be an actual use of a nuclear weapon in whatever form, a tactical nuclear weapon, as we've already talked about, much will depend on what is the global response. And it could go in two directions. One is, as happened after World War I with chemical weapons. You know, chemical weapons were used in World War I. About 1.3 million soldiers suffered severe burn injuries, and out of that, more than 100,000 died. And there was a lot of horror at it. And so there was, in 1925, just 5 years later, was the Geneva Protocol, which banned the use of chemicals and poisonous gases and asphyxiating agents and so on. And then many decades later, in 1993, we actually concluded a chemical weapons convention, which not just banned their use, but also their production and all of that. So that is, were a weapon to be used, that could be one direction in which the world could move. Namely, it shocks the global conscience and you move towards global nuclear disarmament. The other is, as Manpreet was saying,
horizontal proliferation.
That if the global conscience is not shocked into this realization, then it means the collapse of the non-proliferation regime, because then it means that countries will feel that they are entitled for their own security to be able to acquire this. And that would take us into a very different 21st century world.
If I can just add to this, I think it's in everybody's interest that the norm of non-use is maintained. Because if the weapon is used, as Sir said, if the weapon is used and it doesn't get responded to, then well, the world survives for sure. But it conventionalizes the use of nuclear weapons, which is extremely scary scenario. Given in our region, we've got countries like Pakistan and China who have spoken about this kind of a strategy of tactical nuclear weapons. If it gets used and it gets responded to, then we are in a difficult situation for sure, because the ecological, socio-economic, political impact of that use of nuclear weapon is going to be extremely difficult to manage. So I think it's best if the weapon doesn't get used.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Sood and Dr. Sethi, for sharing your thoughts with us. As our panelists have explained so lucidly, nuclear threats, because of their existential nature, have to be taken seriously. We have also seen that there are conditions when nuclear threats work and when they don't. Let us hope, as Dr. Sethi said, that we never have conditions which involve the use of nuclear weapons, because nuclear deterrence still matters. That is all I have for you in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Thanks for watching and goodbye.